This is the story of two dreams. The first of these dreams started as a single thought by John Spreckles. Build a railroad serving the growing city of San Diego. Specifically, the railroad should have connections to the eastern United States. However, it was this easterly criteria that became the plague for the railroad, and thusly giving it the name, the Impossible Railroad. On September 7, 1907, the San Diego and Arizona Railway was born at a ground-cutting ceremony within the city limits of the railroad's namesake. Over the next 10 years, railroad crews built south to Tijuana, Mexico, then east to Tecate and Lindero, then north back into the United States before heading east again. The right-of-way was pushed through 4 tunnels, crossed several large trestles, and climbed grades as steep as 3% in order to arrive at Campo, California on September 16, 1916. Though the trials and tribulations were great, nothing prepared construction crews for what lay ahead, a short, 10-mile-long canyon, the Carrizo Gorge. It is here where the second dream begins. Biking into the gorge, following the Impossible Railroad, and making our way down to the world's largest curved wooden trestle. The bike ride begins close to the small town of Jacumba, California, where the San Diego and Arizona Railway had reached in January 1917. About a mile north of Jacumba, the tracks cross under Highway 8 and begin their perilous drop into the Carrizo Gorge. In February 1917, construction crews reached the location of Tunnel 5, a 400-foot-long timber-lined tunnel. Over the course of the next 12 miles, railroad workers needed to bore 16 more tunnels. It is interesting to note, when entering Tunnel 5, the Carrizo Creek is about 20 feet below the roadbed. However, once through the tunnel, the creek bed is nearly 120 feet below, as the tracks cross the threshold of Carrizo Gorge. Not only did crews need to bore numerous tunnels and construct a narrow shelf for the rails to follow, but they were also required to build special bridges called side hill trestles. Where there wasn't room for a shelf, they built trestles to circumvent the cliffsides. These unusual constructions literally cling to the sides of crags and rock faces. They are nearly level on the ground on one side, but hang as much as 45 feet above the ground on the other. A few miles into the gorge, we came upon Tunnel 6, which was completed in August 1918. Because of the numerous tunnels needed to be bored along the right-of-way, multiple tunnels were worked on at the same time. At each one, crews blasted from opposite ends, always meeting somewhere in the middle. first 6 months after the railroad opened, disaster struck at Tunnel 7 on May 10, 1920. A spectacular landslide and cave-in forced the closure of the railroad for nearly 2 months. Construction crews used 63,000 pounds of dynamite and black powder, 4 steam shovels, and over 100 workers to remove the 120,000 cubic yards of dirt and debris. In all, the slide was over 600 feet long, 200 feet tall, and 200 feet wide. Much to the railroad's detriment, on October 22, 1932, the same tunnel caught fire and collapsed, forcing the right-of-way to be relayed around the mountain on a narrow, winding ridge. Tunnel 8 is located at the far northern end of the Tunnel 7 shoe fly. When surveyors reached this point, they found no way around the mountain that loomed before them. With no choice, crews arrived in mid-1918 and began blasting away at what became a 2,597-foot-long tunnel, the longest on the entire railroad. After being in complete darkness for over 10 minutes, the sunlight was welcomed like an old friend. Once through the long, dark tunnel number 8, the tracks resume clinging to the sides of cliffs again, but only for a short while, as tunnels 9 and 10 are only a quarter of a mile away. After exiting Tunnel 11, there was once a short siding nestled in the cliffside. Aptly named Carrizo Gorge, the siding was of momentous importance, for it was here on Saturday, November 15, 1919, John Spreckles hammered a ceremonial gold spike into place. The 148-mile-long railroad required $18 million, 12 years, 2 months, 1 week, and 5 days to complete. If laid end to end, there is over 2.5 miles of trestles and almost 14,000 feet of tunnels. Upon driving the gold spike into place, John Spreckles claimed the defining moment to be the happiest in his life. In later years, the diminutive siding became a regular stop for chartered passenger trains, as everyone riding the rails wished to see the final spot where the impossible railroad became possible. The San Diego and Arizona Railway was purchased by the Southern Pacific in 1933 and renamed the San Diego and Arizona Eastern Railroad. Following 43 years of operating the line, Southern Pacific filed to abandon the Carrizo Gorge section of the railroad after a series of severe storms washed away several trestles and collapsed 3 tunnels. Though abandonment was denied, the railway lay dormant until 2001 when a group of investors created the Carrizo Gorge Railway. The necessary maintenance cost over $5 million. The hope was to open the line at interchange with the Union Pacific, allowing double-stack trains to operate between El Centro and San Diego. However, by 2008, the line was embargoed because of needed repairs to tunnels and retaining walls. Despite the fact that no trains currently operate through the gorge, there are obvious signs of continuing improvement work inside many of the tunnels. The right-of-way passes through tunnels 12 and 13, each relatively short. Though straight as an arrow, Tunnel 14 is just over 2,000 feet long, necessitating the need for the handlebar-mounted lights once again. Just after exiting Tunnel 14, Old Tunnel 15 becomes visible. On March 27, 1932, due to most likely a small earthquake, the eastern portal of Tunnel 15 collapsed. Crews were brought in and repairs made. 3 days later, the earth shifted again, causing irreparable damage to the tunnel. This necessitated the rerouting of the right-of-way and the boring of a much shorter, new Tunnel 15. The collapse and relocation of Tunnel 15 ultimately became the reason for the bike ride into the Carrizo Gorge. Along with the new tunnel, crews had to construct what became the largest curved wooden trestle in the world, the Goat Canyon Trestle. Standing at 185 feet tall, spanning 633 feet in length, and containing more than 157,000 linear feet of lumber, the Goat Canyon Trestle was completed and opened on July 6, 1932, 101 days after the old Tunnel 15 collapsed. After a quick regrouping, we continued further down the railroad as our sights were now set on riding across the series of side-hill trestles named the Seven Sisters. Immediately after crossing the Goat Canyon Trestle, the rails plunge into the odd, cave-like bore of Tunnel 16. Two tunnels later, we encountered the first of the 7 cliff-clinging trestles. According to legend, these trestles were named after 7 nuns who walked through the gorge in 1870 while on a missionary trip between San Diego and Tucson, Arizona. Because of careful engineering and a speed restriction of only 15 miles per hour, derailments in the gorge were rare. In fact, there were only 3 recorded derailments happening within the confines of the canyon. One in 1925, another in 1953, and this one which happened in 1988 when Kyle Railways operated the railroad. Throughout its entire life, the Impossible Railroad consistently operated in the red and rarely saw a profit. After World War II broke out, revenue traffic increased to its peak levels in 1943. Besides military recruits packing the trains heading to San Diego, there was heavy demand for supplies and equipment which the railroad was happy to haul. As a result, 20,554 carloads of commodities were hauled, with a gross income of $1.6 million. When adding the $436,000 from passenger service, the railroad grossed over $2 million that year. Unfortunately, once the railroad paid for its operating costs and maintenance of the right-of-way, locomotives, and rolling stock, the result was a disappointing $11,000 deficit. The moniker, the Impossible Railroad, seems to speak more for its operating budget than it does for its passage through the Carrizo Gorge. Of the $18 million required to build the entire San Diego and Arizona Railway, $4 million was used to build the 12 miles of railroad through the Carrizo Gorge. It was said John Spreckels would do anything, not only to open the line, but to keep it running in the face of so many natural disasters. And he put his money where his mouth was. Of the original sum, Spreckels invested $11.5 million of his own money to make sure the Impossible Railroad would indeed operate. In 1933, the Southern Pacific Railroad paid $2.8 million for the entire railroad, buildings, locomotives, and rolling stock included. Of that sum, the Spreckels family received a paltry $1 million. About a half mile below the Seven Sisters, the railroad enters Tunnel 19 and in doing so exits the Carrizo Gorge. Though the railroad continues downgrade for another 3 miles and passes through one more tunnel before reaching the valley floor, time was short and sunlight began to wane. It was time to head back home. Tired, hungry, and a little sunburned, we made our way back through the tunnels, over the trestles, through the cuts, along the cliffs, back up the railroad to Jacumba. Along the way, we couldn't help but reminisce what the railroad must have been like in its heyday, and what it took to build this impossible railroad. As we left the tracks and headed back to the car, it became apparent that our ride was so much more than just a trip to see a trestle. It showed what can happen when one person has an idea, and through the very worst, through the impossible, still believes in pursuing dreams.